In the grand halls of British aristocracy, few names shine as brightly, or as scandalously, as that of Lady Edwina Mountbatten. Born into opulence, married into royalty, and entangled in affairs both romantic and political, Edwina's life reads more like a novel than a biography. But behind the pearls, the power, and the press photos lay a woman driven by curiosity, compassion, and controversy. This is not just a story of wealth and titles. It is a tale of love, loss, betrayal, and legacy. Welcome to the untold story of Lady Edwina Mountbatten. The secrets she kept, the scandals she endured, and the woman she truly was. The year was 1901. As the Victorian era came to a close and a new century dawned with hope and ambition, a child was born who would one day become one of Britain's most controversial and fascinating aristocrats. Her name was Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley, a name that would come to command admiration, curiosity, and scandal in equal measure. From the moment of her birth, Edwina was surrounded by extraordinary privilege. She was born into the Ashley family, Old English aristocracy, but it was not her father's lineage that set her apart. It was the towering shadow of her maternal grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassel, that defined the world into which she was born. Sir Ernest Cassel was no ordinary man, a self-made multimillionaire. He was a German-born Jewish banker who had migrated to Britain and risen to become one of the most powerful financial figures of the age. His clients included the future King Edward VII, and his influence reached the very heart of the British Empire. Cassel wasn't just wealthy. He was connected, strategic, and deeply trusted by royalty. And little Edwina, his granddaughter, was his favorite. After her mother's early death in 1911, when Edwina was just 10 years old, Sir Ernest Cassel took her under his wing. He raised her in a world of lavish estates, elite social circles, and direct access to the corridors of power. His London mansion, Brooke House on Park Lane, became her childhood home. It was filled with servants, artwork, opulence, and a striking sense of loneliness. Despite the wealth, Edwina's early years were not marked by emotional warmth. Her father, Wilfred Ashley, later remarried, but Edwina never felt at home with her stepmother, Muriel Forbes Semple. The girl with everything: money, prestige, luxury, was also a child aching for attention, structure, and love. But rather than retreat into that loneliness, Edwina began to develop what would become the defining traits of her personality: resilience, independence, and curiosity. She was sharp, observant, and despite her refined appearance, restless. Even as a teenager, she questioned the rigid conventions of the British aristocracy. She read widely, absorbed new ideas, and refused to be defined solely by the silver spoon in her mouth. By the time she was 18, Edwina was already one of the most talked about debutantes in London. She was tall, strikingly beautiful, and possessed a rare self-assurance that captivated both men and women. Newspapers began to write about her, not just because of her wealth, though that was considerable, but because of her confidence and wit. She was bold, fashionable, and just a bit unpredictable. And of course there was the fortune. When Sir Ernest Cassel died in 1921, he left the bulk of his immense estate, rumored to be worth tens of millions of pounds, to Edwina. It made her one of the richest women in Europe at just 20 years old. But instead of settling into the life of a quiet heiress, Edwina became more determined than ever to write her own story. She traveled. She attended elite gatherings. She mingled with diplomats, artists, and visionaries. Her wealth gave her access to the most exclusive circles in Europe. But it was her personality that made her unforgettable. It was in this glittering world of the post-Edwardian elite that Lord Louis Mountbatten entered her life. Louis Mountbatten was, on the surface, the perfect match. Born into European royalty, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, and second cousin to both King George V and Tsar Nicholas II, Mountbatten had noble blood and military ambition. He was handsome, well-mannered, and carried himself with the polished ease of a man who belonged in palaces. But most of all, Mountbatten was hungry for success, for power, and for a brilliant partner who could help him climb the ranks of British society. Edwina was that partner. Their courtship, while brief, became the talk of London's high society. It wasn't just a union of blue blood and banknotes. It was a strategic alliance, a perfect merger of heritage and capital. In July 1922, Edwina Ashley and Lord Louis Mountbatten were married in a ceremony so lavish it rivaled royal weddings. The guest list included European nobility, political dignitaries, and members of the British royal family. The newspapers were ecstatic. A beautiful heiress and a dashing naval officer. What could possibly go wrong? But behind the grandeur of that wedding day lay two people who were both ambitious, both complex, and perhaps, ultimately incompatible. While Louis adored Edwina's wealth and brilliance, he was also deeply committed to his naval career, which kept him away from home for long periods. Edwina, meanwhile, was entering marriage with emotional baggage, unresolved grief, and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. Their early years as husband and wife were filled with extravagant travel, glittering parties, and social success, but emotional fulfillment was harder to find. The more Edwina sought meaning beyond the role of aristocratic wife, the more distant Louis became, and the cracks began to show. But before the scandals, before the lovers, before India, Nehru or war, there was just Edwina, a lonely girl turned dazzling heiress, trying to navigate a world that gave her everything, except the one thing she wanted most, a sense of belonging. This was the beginning of her story. Not just a debutante, not just a wife, not just a name in the history books, but a woman on the brink of becoming something far more interesting and far more dangerous to the carefully maintained order of the British upper class. The year was 1922. At just 21 years old, Edwina Ashley stood at the center of a dazzling whirlwind. Her wedding to Lord Louis Mountbatten had just taken place at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, in front of the who's who of British nobility. Her dress was custom-designed, her jewels sparkled with castle family wealth, and the newspapers raved about England's fairy tale couple. To the outside world, it looked like a match made in heaven, an extraordinary heiress marrying into the heart of European royalty. But behind the flowers, the flashbulbs, and the formal smiles lay the beginning of one of the most emotionally complex and quietly fractured marriages in British high society. Edwina had married a Mountbatten, but not just any Mountbatten. Louis was the great-grandson of Queen Victoria and first cousin to the future Prince Philip. He was charming, polished, and ambitious. From a young age, he had been groomed for greatness within the British Royal Navy and aspired to climb the ranks of both military and political power. He had a title, a famous name, and royal blood, but not the kind of fortune needed to fund his ambitions. That's where Edwina came in. Her wealth, inherited directly from her grandfather Sir Ernest Cassel, provided Louis with the lifestyle and influence that his title alone could not support. But it wasn't a one-sided arrangement. Edwina, for all her wit and charm, was looking for something too. Perhaps it was love, perhaps it was stability, or perhaps it was a partner who could match her social standing and offer the prestige of royal association. In many ways, it was a marriage of mutual benefit, strategic, calculated, impressive on paper, but not immune to human flaws. In the early days, there was excitement. The couple traveled extensively, honeymooning across America and embarking on global tours that included India, Japan, and Australia. They hosted glittering parties, attended royal functions, and mingled with politicians, dignitaries, and artists. They were a glamorous, high-profile couple who drew attention wherever they went. And yet, something was missing. Louis was deeply absorbed in his naval career, often away for long periods. He was consumed by discipline, ambition, and the structure of military life. Edwina, on the other hand, was left behind, restless, brilliant, and bored. For a woman with her intellect, curiosity, and emotional intensity, the idle life of a naval officer's wife in post-war Britain soon became stifling. She tried in the beginning to play the part, the hosting, the travel, the societal expectations. But Edwina was not born to be decorative. She needed meaning, purpose, and intimacy. With Louis away at sea, she began to drift. And it didn't take long before the whispers began. Rumors of extramarital affairs swirled through London's elite circles. At first, they were dismissed as idle gossip. After all, wasn't infidelity practically a rite of passage among the upper class? But in Edwina's case, the rumors carried weight. Some were too well-sourced, too consistent. Her name began to be linked with artists, diplomats, and even African-American jazz singer Leslie Hutch Hutchinson. A scandal that would have destroyed any lesser woman in that era. Hutchinson was charismatic, talented, and devastatingly attractive, but also black and working class, in a deeply segregated and class-conscious society. Their rumored relationship shocked even the most liberal of London's aristocracy. The tabloids couldn't touch the story. Her position and power made her untouchable. But behind closed doors, the scandal was real. And yet, Edwina remained undeterred. She lived by her own rules, refused to be cornered by tradition, and saw no contradiction between her public role and her private desires. In fact, it was this very contradiction that made her so fascinating, both admired and feared by those around her. Louis Mountbatten, for his part, was not a passive victim of infidelity. He, too, was rumored to have romantic entanglements, including, though never confirmed, relationships with men. While some biographers have explored these claims in depth, Louis himself remained publicly silent, his sexuality never addressed in official records. What is known, however, is that he tolerated Edwina's affairs, and she tolerated his. They developed what many now consider an early form of an open marriage, a quiet agreement to maintain appearances, support each other publicly, but live separate emotional lives. It was for its time revolutionary, and it worked at least on the surface. Despite their private lives diverging, the Mountbattens continued to operate as a cohesive public unit. They raised two daughters, Patricia and Pamela, and upheld all the duties expected of them in aristocratic society. They attended royal events, oversaw charities, and remained in the public eye. And through it all, there remained a strange kind of loyalty between Edwina and Louis. They were not in love as the public imagined it, but they shared a bond deeper than romance. Mutual respect, emotional understanding, a strange, almost unbreakable connection. Louis once described Edwina as a truly remarkable woman, and admitted later in life that she had been more complex than anyone ever realized. They wrote letters to each other when apart, warm, thoughtful, sometimes even flirtatious. There was affection and even moments of tenderness, though rarely passion. They were less husband and wife, and more like political allies, co-architects of a shared empire built on diplomacy, elegance, and image. Still, the emotional toll on Edwina was real. Her letters and journals, many of which surfaced decades later, reveal a woman haunted by restlessness, a longing for intimacy that never quite arrived. She was both a glittering socialite and a lonely soul, admired by all, understood by few. What made Edwina so difficult to define was also what made her unforgettable. She had the audacity to live by her own emotional compass. In an age when aristocratic women were expected to smile politely and accept their roles, Edwina defied convention. She sought connection in a world built on appearances. She pursued passion in a society that demanded silence. And while it shocked many, it also made her something rare. A woman in control of her own story. By the 1930s, the Mountbattens had long since given up the illusion of traditional marriage. Yet, rather than implode, their relationship evolved. Edwina had lovers, some long-term. Louis had companions. But they always returned to one another, to co-host events, to vacation, to raise their children, to strategize, and ultimately, to maintain the carefully curated facade of the modern aristocratic couple. But beneath that facade, a deeper transformation was taking place, one that would soon take Edwina far from the ballrooms of London and into the burning heart of World War II. By the time the 1930s gave way to war, Lady Edwina Mountbatten had long been a fixture in British high society, a name whispered with both admiration and intrigue. Her marriage to Lord Louis Mountbatten had stabilized into a quiet partnership of mutual understanding, but emotionally, she was still adrift. The scandals had cooled but not vanished. The headlines now gave her more space, but her heart remained restless. Then, in 1939, everything changed. The world plunged into the darkness of World War II. And in that chaos, Edwina found something she had never truly known before: purpose. When Britain declared war on Germany, Edwina Mountbatten did not retreat to a countryside estate or hide behind her title. She did something unexpected. Something that challenged every preconceived notion about what an aristocratic woman was supposed to be. She stepped forward. With her characteristic decisiveness, Edwina joined the St. John Ambulance Brigade, an organization with which she had already been affiliated. But now, she didn't just lend her name to the cause. She rolled up her sleeves and took charge. She was soon appointed superintendent-in-chief of the entire brigade, overseeing tens of thousands of volunteers across Britain and in colonial outposts. At a time when many women of her class offered moral support from afar, Edwina was on the ground, in uniform, facing the same dangers as the nurses, medics, and ambulance drivers she commanded. And she was good at it. Really good. And an unshakable calm in the face of catastrophe, Edwina coordinated complex relief efforts across bombed-out British cities. During the Blitz, when London came under nightly attack, she was seen helping evacuate children, comforting wounded civilians, and organizing mobile hospitals. Those who worked alongside her were often surprised. Wasn't this the same woman who once wore diamonds to dinner and caused gossip column chaos in Mayfair? They expected vanity, aloofness, perhaps a carefully curated photo op. What they saw instead was competence, stamina, and real leadership. She didn't just visit hospitals, she helped run them. She didn't just speak to wounded soldiers, she sat with them for hours, wrote letters on their behalf, and insisted on better conditions for their care. She developed a reputation for being relentless when it came to logistics. Trains of supplies, barracks full of cots, mobile kitchens. Edwina was everywhere, all at once. This was not about image anymore. For the first time, Edwina Mountbatten was writing her own chapter, not in the society pages, but in the annals of wartime history. Her transformation wasn't a calculated PR stunt. It was genuine, born of something that had lived in her all along, a need to connect, to feel useful, to matter. And the war gave her that in ways that her wealth, her marriage, and even her lovers never had. But war brings more than duty. It brings trauma. Edwina's journals from this time reveal a growing heaviness in her spirit. She witnessed things few aristocrats ever had to see. Children burned in air raids, mothers screaming in rubble, young soldiers dying without family. These experiences left a mark. And yet, instead of retreating, Edwina moved toward the fire. She began traveling outside Britain, inspecting field hospitals and refugee camps in North Africa, the Middle East, and India. Her travels became increasingly international and politically complex, often placing her in dangerous zones. Still, she persisted. Louis Mountbatten, too, had risen in stature during the war. He was appointed Chief of Combined Operations and later Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. As he climbed military ranks, Edwina carved out her own parallel path, not as a wife at his side, but as a wartime leader in her own right. And yet, in public, they still appeared together. They wrote warm letters. They supported each other's work. And slowly, a surprising narrative emerged. The Mountbattens, once seen as a scandal-ridden couple, were now being respected for their contributions to Britain's war effort. But Edwina's work wasn't just limited to medical care. She became deeply involved in logistical planning for civilian evacuations, especially during air raids. Her strategies helped countless families find safe shelter. She visited prisoner-of-war camps, advocated for mental health support for soldiers returning home, and frequently challenged government inaction when it came to civilian welfare. She was no longer just Lady Edwina, the glittering hostess of cocktail parties. She was Commander Edwina Mountbatten, a voice of compassion and practicality in a world consumed by violence. Still, despite her newfound identity, Edwina could never fully escape her past. Some officials resented her aristocratic status and questioned her qualifications. Others whispered that her involvement was only tolerated because of her husband's growing power in the military. But those who worked with her knew better. They saw a woman who had broken through the expectations of her gender and class, who had transformed from a socialite into a soldier of mercy. She didn't need medals, though she would receive many. She didn't need headlines, though they came too. What Edwina needed, what she had always needed, was to feel necessary. And for the first time in her life, she was. By the time World War II came to an end in 1945, Edwina Mountbatten was no longer just a footnote in someone else's story. She was a force. Her marriage had survived, though it had long since become a partnership more than a romance. She and Louis had grown closer, not in the way newlyweds do, but like veterans of the same war, bound together by mutual experience and deep, if complicated, respect. And yet, the world Edwina returned to was not the one she had left. The empire was crumbling. The aristocracy was losing its grip. And British society, once built on hierarchy, appearances, and tradition, was being forced to confront a new reality. But Edwina wasn't going back to the old world. She had already changed, and she had no intention of standing still. In fact, she was about to step onto a new battlefield, one far more complex, far more political, and far more personal, because soon Lady Edwina Mountbatten would follow her husband to India, not just as a former war heroine or aristocratic humanitarian, but as a key figure in the final days of the British Raj. It was there that she would meet the man who would define the next, and perhaps most controversial, chapter of her life. His name was Jawaharlal Nehru. But that is a story for another chapter. In 1947, as the sun was setting on the British Empire, Lord Louis Mountbatten was appointed the last Viceroy of India, tasked with overseeing one of the most difficult and emotionally charged transitions in colonial history, the partition of British India. He was chosen not just for his royal connections or military prestige, but because the British government believed he could manage the crumbling empire's most volatile exit with grace and speed. But Louis did not come alone. Alongside him was Lady Edwina Mountbatten, now in her 40s, seasoned by war, transformed by humanitarian work, and fully determined to make this role matter. The Mountbattens arrived in India not as detached rulers, but as complex human beings carrying personal histories and emotional baggage. The political storm they stepped into was unlike anything they had experienced. India was not just on the brink of independence, it was on the verge of violent disintegration. Communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims were erupting into riots. Millions were being displaced. Bloodshed, fear, and resentment hung heavy in the air. The clock was ticking, and the stakes could not have been higher. For Edwina, this was not just another diplomatic posting. It was a new battlefield, one where empathy, intuition, and compassion would matter just as much as politics. She wasn't content to play the ornamental role of vicereine. Instead, she threw herself into relief efforts, traveling across the subcontinent, often alone or with just a small staff, visiting refugee camps, tending to injured women and children, and advocating for resources and food supplies. Her work was hands-on, gritty, and personal, but it was in New Delhi, amid the crumbling architecture of colonial power and the rising voices of independence, that Edwina Mountbatten met Jawaharlal Nehru, a man who would challenge not only her views but her heart. Nehru, the leader of the Indian National Congress, was already a legend. A brilliant statesman, Oxford-educated, fiercely nationalistic yet deeply intellectual. He had spent years in prison under British rule, yet he bore no personal hatred. His presence was magnetic, stoic, elegant, thoughtful. From their first conversation, something between Edwina and Nehru sparked quietly, not in scandalous glances or reckless passion, but in understanding. They were, on the surface, worlds apart, an English aristocrat in the face of anti-colonial struggle. But emotionally, they recognized something familiar in each other: loneliness, weariness, and an unrelenting desire to do good in a broken world. Their friendship deepened with each meeting. What began as formal political discussions gradually evolved into long walks through the Mughal gardens, late-night conversations over books, and handwritten letters exchanged in secrecy. In those letters, now preserved in archives and biographies, there is no denying the tenderness, even poetry, of their connection. Some historians insist theirs was a platonic bond, a meeting of minds. Others argue it was a full-blown affair, hidden behind diplomatic protocol. The truth, as with many of Edwina's secrets, lies in nuance. What's undeniable is that they adored each other, in a way that defied their roles, their nations, and their duty. Even Louis Mountbatten was aware of it, and remarkably, perhaps shockingly, he accepted it. The Mountbattens had long lived outside the bounds of a traditional marriage, and this emotional triangle, while unconventional, was not one of betrayal but of strange, layered understanding. Louis once told a friend, she and Nehru were in love, but it was a perfectly honorable relationship. This bond between Edwina and Nehru came at a time of unimaginable pain for India. In August 1947, when independence was declared, it came with partition, the carving of Pakistan from India's body. The Mountbattens had pushed for a peaceful transition, but chaos unfolded instead. Trains packed with fleeing families were ambushed. Villages were slaughtered. Nearly 1 million people were killed, and over 15 million displaced. Edwina was devastated. She visited hospitals and refugee camps where conditions were appalling. People starving, women mutilated, children orphaned. She spent days trying to coordinate aid. Nehru often met her at these sites, and together they stood, not as colonizer and subject, but as two human beings surrounded by suffering. And yet, in these darkest days, Edwina found a kind of clarity. India had changed her. It broke down the last walls of her aristocratic detachment and rebuilt her as a global humanitarian. Her friendship with Nehru wasn't a scandal, it was a transformation. He gave her a lens to view the world beyond empire, beyond Britain's fading grip. And she gave him comfort, kindness, and a rare sense of vulnerability amid the weight of leadership. Even after the Mountbattens returned to England in 1948, Edwina and Nehru continued to write to each other. Their letters, though heavily censored by biographers, pulse with warmth, longing, and deep intellectual intimacy. Some letters were signed simply, "Yours always, Edwina." Others from Nehru carried lines like, "You have become part of my life." Publicly, Edwina was awarded honors and accolades for her service in India. Privately, she carried scars, both from the horrors of partition and the quiet ache of being separated from Nehru. Though they would see each other again during diplomatic visits, the intensity of their time in India could never truly be recreated. As the British Empire receded, Edwina emerged not as a symbol of colonial arrogance but as a figure of moral complexity, a woman who entered India as a vicereine and left as something far more profound, a witness, a partner in grief, a friend to a nation in labor. And still many couldn't accept it. Publicly, Edwina was awarded honors and accolades for her service in India. Privately, she carried scars, both from the horrors of partition and the quiet ache of being separated from Nehru. Though they would see each other again during diplomatic visits, the intensity of their time in India could never truly be recreated. As the British Empire receded, Edwina emerged not as a symbol of colonial arrogance but as a figure of moral complexity, a woman who entered India as a vicereine and left as something far more profound, a witness, a partner in grief, a friend to a nation in labor. And still many couldn't accept it. British tabloids whispered. Indian politicians speculated. The press circled the Nehru-Mountbatten relationship with both fascination and suspicion. But neither Edwina nor Nehru gave them anything. They never spoke publicly of their bond. They protected it fiercely. In one of her final interviews, Edwina once said, "There are some relationships that don't need to be explained, only lived." India had changed her forever. Not through scandal but through truth. Through pain. Through love. Through a realization that beneath all the uniforms, the pearls and the politics, she had found the one connection that made her feel whole. And that, above all, is the true scandal. That a woman so misunderstood by history may have finally found her soul's counterpart in the most unlikely place imaginable. But time as always moves on. And in the years to come, Edwina would continue to travel the world, quietly working for the Red Cross, aiding refugees, delivering medical supplies. Yet no experience, no person, no mission ever touched her again like India or Nehru. The years following Edwina Mountbatten's return from India were quieter, but never idle. Though no longer in the spotlight of empire, she did not slow down. Instead, she redirected her energy into a new kind of purpose: global humanitarian work. In war-torn regions of Southeast Asia and Africa, Edwina could be found, often without fanfare, coordinating medical shipments, visiting remote hospitals, and speaking with refugees. Her name still opened doors, but it was her determination, not her title, that kept them open. To the British public, she was now a respected figure, transformed from the once notorious socialite into a dignified humanitarian. The scandals of her youth faded, replaced by headlines praising her tireless service and compassion. She no longer craved attention. She had found contentment in service. And yet, one thread still tied her to the world she had once shaken so deeply: Jawaharlal Nehru. Their relationship, though now mostly long-distance, endured. The letters between them continued. Less frequent, perhaps, but no less heartfelt. Whenever their paths crossed in official visits or international conferences, there was a familiarity, a deep, unspoken understanding. Neither needed to speak in grand declarations. The connection had already been sealed, etched into the silences between their words. In public, they were cordial, warm, appropriate. In private, they remained each other's quiet solace. By the late 1950s, Edwina was traveling extensively for the St. John Ambulance Brigade and the Red Cross, often under physically punishing conditions. She ignored the warnings of friends and doctors who urged her to rest. But she was never one to slow down. Not for age, not for illness, and certainly not for appearances. In February 1960, Edwina departed for yet another mission, this time to North Borneo, modern-day Malaysia. It was humid, remote, and physically draining, but typical of her dedication. She insisted on visiting every medical unit in the region. Those who met her there remembered a woman who, despite looking physically fragile, commanded every room with grace and quiet authority. Then, on February 21st, in the early hours of the morning, Edwina Mountbatten died in her sleep. The cause was reported as heart failure. She was 58 years old. Her body was found in her bed, surrounded by letters, photographs, and personal keepsakes, including several from Jawaharlal Nehru. The news of her death rippled through Britain, but in India, it hit like a storm. When Nehru was informed, he was shattered. Those close to him said he received the news in silence, retreating into his study for hours. Aides reported seeing him weep. For a man known for his composure, his grief was raw and visible. And then came a gesture that stunned even his closest colleagues. Nehru requested that Edwina Mountbatten's body be buried at sea from an Indian Navy vessel, a highly symbolic act of honor. The Indian Navy ship INS Trishul carried her coffin into the Indian Ocean, where sailors, many of whom she had once comforted and helped during the partition crisis, laid her to rest in solemn ceremony. It was as if the sea became their final meeting place, a quiet farewell between two souls who had shared a private, unshakable bond amid the noise of politics and history. Louis Mountbatten, dignified in mourning, accepted Nehru's gesture with quiet respect. He knew what Edwina had meant to Nehru, and perhaps what Nehru had meant to her. At her funeral, Louis is said to have stood silently, tears in his eyes, watching as the sea took his wife, not with resentment, but with reverence. In her will, Edwina requested no grand memorial, no ornate gravestone, just the sea, just silence. And in that silence, she left behind one of the most powerful, complex, and misunderstood legacies of her era. Edwina Mountbatten had lived many lives. A glittering debutante, a scandalous aristocrat, a restless wife, a bold humanitarian, and a woman who dared to feel deeply in a world that demanded restraint. She defied labels. She broke rules. And most of all, she reclaimed her narrative in an age when women of her class were rarely allowed to write their own. To some, she remains a controversial figure, remembered for rumors, wealth, and unconventional choices. To others, she is a symbol of resilience and reinvention. A woman who used her privilege to serve rather than simply to shine. Her love for Nehru remains one of history's most whispered romances, a story rarely written in official accounts, yet deeply felt in the margins of letters and memories. And though we may never know the full nature of their bond, we know this: it changed both of them. It changed how they saw power, how they saw service, and how they saw the world. Today, Edwina Mountbatten's name is a footnote in most history books, overshadowed by her husband's title, reduced to rumors, often misunderstood. But if you look closely, beneath the headlines, behind the whispers, you'll find a woman who burned brighter than the empire she served. A woman who made mistakes, yes, but also made a difference. She died far from home, but she died in purpose. And in the quiet waters of the Indian Ocean, she found a final peace that eluded her in life. That is the untold story of Lady Edwina Mountbatten. When Edwina Mountbatten's ashes were scattered into the Indian Ocean from the decks of an Indian Navy ship, it was meant to be a quiet, dignified farewell. But what followed in the months and years after her passing was anything but silent. Her death didn't end the conversation, it amplified it. For those who had known her closely, grief was immediate. For those who had judged her from afar, curiosity returned. And for historians, biographers, and royal watchers alike, Lady Edwina's story became a puzzle, one that refused to fit neatly into any narrative. To the British establishment, Edwina's passing was a formal matter. Statements were issued, tributes made, honors posthumously acknowledged. She was praised for her service during World War II, her leadership in humanitarian efforts, and her unwavering commitment during the blood-soaked days of Indian partition. But what they didn't mention, not officially, was the deep and enduring bond with Nehru, or the fact that India had claimed her as one of its own in the end. That chapter was too complex, too emotionally charged, and perhaps too inconvenient for imperial memory. Yet in India, her legacy took on a more personal shape. Among the countless people she had helped, refugees, nurses, children orphaned by partition, Edwina Mountbatten was remembered not as a foreign ruler's wife, but as a woman who had stood with them when so few others did. In medical outposts and dusty archives, her name still evoked gratitude. She had, against all odds, built real relationships across borders, religions, and traumas. And then there was Jawaharlal Nehru. In the years following her death, Nehru continued to lead a newly independent India through its turbulent early years. He remained stoic in public, measured in words. But those close to him noticed a subtle change, a quietness that deepened after Edwina's passing. The woman who had once been his emotional refuge was gone, and her absence left a hollow he would never quite fill. Their letters, some of which later surfaced, painted a picture of mutual devotion rarely seen between such powerful figures. Nehru once wrote, "She was so much to me for so many years. She brought sweetness, understanding, and a strange peace I could not find elsewhere." He never publicly elaborated further, but in private, Edwina's memory remained very much alive. He kept her letters. He reread them. And until his death in 1964, for years after Edwina's, he never spoke of another woman the way he had spoken of her. Even Louis Mountbatten, stoic and proper as ever, carried on Edwina's legacy in his own way. In speeches and writings, he often referred to her with warmth and respect. He acknowledged their unconventional marriage, their separate lives, but never with bitterness. If anything, he seemed proud, even quietly moved, by what Edwina had become in her later years. And when Louis himself was assassinated in 1979 by the IRA, it marked the end of an era, not just of one man, but of a strange, dynamic partnership that had defied aristocratic convention, political expectations, and personal tragedy. But perhaps the most haunting part of Edwina's story is not how she lived, or even how she died, but how she has since been misunderstood. For decades, Edwina Mountbatten was portrayed as a footnote in royal biographies, often defined by her scandals, her affairs, or her husband's military career. Some painted her as reckless. Others dismissed her humanitarian work as an attempt at redemption. But these narratives missed the point entirely.